indicated that she would like to go and compare the draft that she had sent as against the signed statement in order to clear the issues relating to paragraph 40, which appears on page 13 of the bundle. The witness has had opportunity to do the comparison to check, and further, there was an engagement between her and the evidence leaders regarding issues around that paragraph in particular. And I would like to start off by dealing with that portion of evidence first before we proceed to deal with the item in paragraph in page 30.
I'm sorry, you said it's paragraph 40. Is it the one on page 13?
That is correct. Page 13, paragraph 40, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Muse, is he there? Okay, thank you. You may then proceed, ma'am.
Commissioners, you'll forgive me if I get confused when I hear the word commissioner. On a slightly lighter note, I do sometimes look when the word arises. But on paragraph 40, I'd like to point out that naturally the issue is the allegations around Rear Admiral Johnny Kommerman. It has been drawn to my attention by the evidence leaders because I have not been in a position to follow all of your proceedings. Unfortunately, as you know, as I indicated earlier, we were quite busy earlier this year. So I would like to put that name on record, but I've also been informed during the period of the break by the evidence leaders that apparently in the evidence of Rear Admiral Kommerman there was a submission made around permission having been granted, which the contracts provide for. But I don't want to express a view on any of those issues, other just to raise the name, because the name has been raised in your proceedings, and I have been informed of that by the evidence leaders, and I want to clear that space between myself and the commissioners. But I also would like to raise an issue arising from the book on page 265 and 266.
I'm sorry, just hold on. Just before we finish with paragraph 14, if you're saying that you have been informed that the person that you thought had no permission to work for either GSC or GFC, and that that person has provided us with proof that he had permission. Now, what happens to your statement in paragraph 40, in the light of the fact that you know what the truth is?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to delete the last sentence because it has been drawn to my attention by the evidence leaders. And because I am not in a position to verify or otherwise, I think it's wise that I do so in the context of what has emerged.
So we must delete the last portion of paragraph 40.
Because I have no personal knowledge of this.
You have
and
no
I simply
personal
have
knowledge.
heard from the evidence leaders what has been submitted. And I think in order to satisfy the requirements of an oath, I would need to delete this sentence.
Thank you.
Right then, Chair, the witness would like to proceed, but not by starting off with that page 30 where we had ended off, but to also introduce evidence that relates to, that is relevant to this area in particular. May I then proceed to lead the witness? Thank you. You may then proceed, ma'am.
Thank you. And mindful of the fact that this is with respect to an area of which I have personal knowledge, with respect to correspondence between myself and the Ministry of Defence in the United Kingdom, there are documents on page 265 and 266 of the book
I'm
Up in Arms.
I'm sorry. Well, which paragraph are you dealing with?
Mr. Chairman, on the broader issue that arose with respect to paragraph 40,
Which
I'm
arose
introducing evidence in good faith based on items of which I have personal knowledge.
Thank you, I understand.
Thank you. If I may proceed. Thank you. Page 265 and 266 of the book Up in Arms. If I may draw the Commissioner's attention to this. I'd like to particularly draw your attention to issues with respect to BAE systems and issues that were confirmed with respect to Red Diamond Trading and Airborne Trust having received payments from BAE systems. I simply want to introduce that as evidence that you may investigate further, evidence that may come to your attention through the evidence of other witnesses, but I would like to specifically enter this into the record because it's an issue of which I have personal knowledge arising from my correspondence with Julian Brazier in the House of Commons, as well as the interactions between Mr. Brazier and the Ministry of Defence at that time, if I may do so, and then proceed with my statement.
Right. Thank you then. Will you please turn to page 30 and give evidence in relation to the NIPS and DIPS, a question of industrial policy. You may proceed.
Thank you so much to the evidence leaders. Starting on paragraph 85, it is impossible not to weigh the industrial participation component of this procurement as a separate issue, as it touches on a balance between global trade provisions and domestic industrial policy preferences. In this regard, it is important to reflect on these issues in the context of the WTO Plurilateral Agreement on Government Procurement. And here I would like to note that the global infrastructure market is worth $60 trillion and represents 15% of global GDP. The GPA commits countries to non-discrimination and transparency in government procurement. While South Africa is neither a signatory nor an observer at present, the pressure for BRICS member states to join is becoming quite significant. The growing importance of this norm of public international law is set against our country's own policy choices that clearly are constitutionally founded on BBBEE legislation, but also against our use of offsets, such as the National Industrial Participation Agreements and the Defence Industrial Participation Agreements that were at issue in the SDP. South Africa's government procurement policy has been set to a threshold of US $10 million to trigger an offset obligation for a supplier of a product or a service to the South African state. As part of my role on the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises at the time, I looked at this industrial policy matter in great detail vis-à-vis decisions of the then South African Airways Board to purchase 21 Boeing 737-800s, which triggered a national industrial participation obligation for offset investments and job creation. In subsequently engaging with the defence industrial base of the United Kingdom with respect to the Hawk Grip and BAE Saab Denel offset obligation, I started looking more deeply into the quality and enforceability of the NIP and DIP components of the arms deal, as this was also a matter that had bothered the Auditor General in his initial special review, as well as caused Scopa pause in its 14th report. In reviewing the documents in Scopa's possession, it became clear that a lack of enforceable contracts, particularly in terms of the Saab BAE NIP agreements, would be an issue. And I don't want to only single out the supplier, it is a generic point, however. Other than broad provisions for breach of contract under the umbrella agreements, which included provisions for NIPs, the proper enforceability of NIPs on a project-by-project basis, and here I am intending to stipulate contract by contract, project by project, as opposed to the overall trigger that arose with respect to the umbrella agreement, left a lot to be desired, as projects could merely be substituted for one another without amounting to breaches of contract. In the light of this, I requested specific meetings with the then Minister of Trade and Industry about these issues, and his answers were, with due respect to him, not satisfactory. It was clear to me that these DIP and NIP contracts were not enforceable in the usual terms of contract law beyond the broad breach provisions. And here I'm referring to, just to give a concrete example, and I'll continue with the paragraph. If, for example, a list on IP stipulated a steel mill, you couldn't go and contractually enforce the steel mill as an individual contract. There would be overall breach provision that you could go and say, well, there's a potential breach and penalties, but you couldn't go and extract a steel mill on a contract-to-contract basis in that way. It was clear to me that these DIP and NIP contracts were not enforceable in the usual terms of contract law, and that the amount of possible substitution of projects could render the agreements highly problematic in terms of meeting targets for job creation and investment, as the suppliers could simply substitute one for another. Worse still, in some cases, there was no sign of the type of new industrial-based development investment that the NIPs had promised, but either privatizations, for example, a 20% equity stake in Denel, which was very much on the table for conversation, or other parastatals having to spend to make an area susceptible to investment. Because the NIPs were predicated on the assumption that they would be greenfields investment coming into the country, not that it would be an equity stake or a privatization stake. A clear example of this was when the German frigate consortium had proposed a steel mill for the new Kucha IDZ, where this mill would be the anchor tenant. This did not occur due to a meltdown in global steel prices at the time that project delivery became due. And however, the Kucha Development Corporation continued the construction of the deep sea port, and significant public investment ended coming off the balance sheets of Eskom, Transnet and Portnet respectively for the successful development of the port. In late 2001, I asked the Auditor General to investigate the CDC for possible non-compliance with the IDZ regulations and the Manufacturing Development Board statutory provisions, to no avail. I also requested a specific inquiry into the costs public sector companies were now expected to fund to develop the port that subsequently struggled to secure an anchor tenant without proper arms deal offsets finding their way here, specifically the steel mill that I've referred to. If industrial participation or offsets remain a part of our industrial policy preferences, despite the clear shortcomings that have already been conceded, most recently by the Minister of Trade and Industry, and I think it was brave of him to do so and quite frank, we have to revisit any role and status we may have wished to have, perhaps even as an observer with respect to the GPA agreement. In addition, and given the exchange rate movements we've seen and could see in the wake of more quantitative easing by the US Federal Reserve, we may wish to revisit the US 10 million threshold we've applied thus far if the decision is to keep such policies in place. And I think that the evidence emerging before your Commission will be quite important in that regard. However, another lesson learned is perhaps to be more clear about policy objectives instead of trying to dress offsets as something which they're not. A full balancing of the scales of forex outflows on the balance of payments when large infrastructure imports come to South Africa. Because the Warburg-Dillon-Reed model stipulated very clearly, and the modeling created forex outflows stacked up against what could arguably flow in from the offsets to balance the balance of payments. And this is where the difficulties actually arose. With respect to the DIPs, these are questions about the domestic defense industry and industrial policy. In the aftermath of the arms deal, it's important that we have a more open and focused policy discussion on defense procurement and its links to the defense-related industrial base of our country and its export potential. This presupposes that foreign policy objectives are clearly stated and moral hazard is countenanced and export controls transparently adhered to. It's clear that the DIP side of the STP was perhaps more strategic and better thought through as a policy objective, as the local industry has undoubtedly benefited from new export markets in aviation industries in particular. It's also clear from the DoD plan to proceed with Project Hoefyster, the orphan, if you will, of the 1999 SDP, that the industrial policy objective from the local procurement for the SANDF is clear and quite similar to the defense procurement defense industries linkages that we see in the USA, for example. It seems clear that there will be a need for upfront decisions about the defense industry's export base and what it will take to keep it profitable and integrated in global markets, and how to link this where possible with procurement both local and international. I raise this because it arose so strongly in the political dimension of the decision that I've highlighted, where the Minister of Defense is cited in the document I've referred to earlier, because it becomes one of the relevant debates and arguments, and it is a policy argument and a policy debate with political connotations. Upfront policy debates about this is necessary, and the lesson from the late 1990s is probably the question, why should they be hidden debates? Ironically, this is where the visit of the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises to DERA and DISO in the United Kingdom in 2000 becomes relevant. There are therefore some profound lessons from large-scale procurements, whether defense or infrastructure related, or if not lessons, then preferences to be learned from the arms deal, the process of the IMCC and the IONT-like structures, in my view, diminish democratic decision-making and accountability in the normal sense of constitutional prescripts of collective cabinet responsibility to the legislature. Cabinet must thrash out priorities properly, and in 2014 South Africa, in the context of the National Development Plan and associated budget priorities, this implies that future decisions on defense procurement in terms of the new defense review must avoid the pitfalls and learn the lessons of the arms deal saga with respect to policy and accountability questions. Mr. Chairman, I don't want you to indulge me on the further paragraphs on the future of defense and the African Standby Force. I'm happy to leave that part of the testimony if you want me to stop at this point.
Yes, Chair, we have looked at this portion of evidence, the remaining portion, excluding the conclusion, it is actually something that deals with what should happen in the future and so forth, and much of the evidence that has been traversed before this commission has also touched on that. So I would actually concur with the witness that it's actually not necessary to traverse that evidence and read the paragraphs into the record. But that is left to the discretion of the honorable commissioners.
Mr. Ramaka, I hear you saying that this evidence has already been learned. I thought these were her opinions and not evidence. That last portion where she talks about the future is how she sees it. It's the recommendations that she wants to make. That to me appears to be her opinions. Will that be a correct assessment of this paragraph?
Yes, that is the correct assessment. Maybe I should just preface it to say the views that she expresses there. I think there are also a few witnesses who have also expressed their views regarding the issue of the future on procurement and so forth. That is all, Chair, on this portion in particular. Does the Chair then grant...
Oh, we agree with you. We agree with you.
Okay, right, thank you. Now, what I'd like now to take the opportunity to then cross over to the book written by the witness that is up in arms. You have the copies in front of you. I will not deal with the entire contents of the book. I know that's an understatement because that would just be impractical. What we have done as a team has been to identify specific paragraphs and areas that we believe can also be of assistance to the Commission in terms of what is out there in the public about the views, statements, and allegations around the arms deal. May I then take this opportunity to focus your attention to beginning with page 40 of the book. Thank you. Then I'll proceed, Chair, to focus your attention to the second paragraph more towards the end. That is where the author is talking about the purchase of the arsenal as to what it would have made or the effect of or the consequences that also flowed from this acquisition. And in particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the portion where you say the defense procurement packages were signed by the government, which led to the purchase of a whole arsenal of arms and military equipment. It would make some individuals incredibly wealthy and push our new democratic institutions to the brink of cardiac arrest. Now, out of this passage that I have just read, I would like to ask you two questions arising therefrom. And the first question that I would like to ask you is as to whether you can indicate to this commission as to which individuals would then have become incredibly wealthy as a result of the purchase of this equipment.
Mr. Chairman, I would have difficulty naming specific names in terms of individuals who became incredibly wealthy. But certainly with respect to the one element of concrete evidence of which I do have knowledge, I have placed that before the Commission for its future attention with respect to the possible role of the Airborne Trust and Red Diamond Trading. And I would like to put that on the agenda as possible conduits for wealth, but I have no personal knowledge beyond what is contained in the correspondence that I received from the British Ministry of Defence. Beyond that, I would have no personal knowledge of the specific individuals. But the existence of these trusts would suggest to me that there is something for the Commission to look at.
Right, then I'll proceed to the...
Just hold on. The information that you received, does it suggest that Airborne Trust and the other trusts that you've mentioned, did they legitimately receive this money, or is there evidence which suggests that they received the money in a wrongful manner?
Mr. Chairman, I'm suggesting that I simply know that they received money and that it would really be for the Commission to decide the wrongfulness or otherwise. I mean, this is the issue for me. I know that wealth was channeled through two trusts. That is all that I know. Whether that wealth was of a legitimate or illegitimate nature is something that falls beyond my scope, because I don't have the forensic investigative capabilities as an individual to establish that beyond reasonable doubt.
So in other words, the information that you have is that this trust received money. That's all that you have. Thank you.
Right, thanks. Then the second portion, it relates to the democratic institutions. And you say this purchase had the effect of pushing our new democratic institutions to the brink of cardiac arrest. Will you please explain that to the Commission?
Thank you. I think that what I am suggesting in the book is that there were new institutions in place in many cases, and that the pressure around these issues were very significant. They would have been significant pressures, and they are in established democracies. In our country, some of these institutions were post-1996 constitutional institutions that were still, in some cases, in their infancy. And these types of issues, whether they relate to defense or intelligence, do place institutions under incredible strain. In our case, I personally believe that because these were quite new institutions, post-1996 constitution, they were placed under considerable strain. There had never been a multi-agency probe. There had never been a parliamentary standing committee on public accounts environment where any cabinet minutes of any description, whether of an interministerial cabinet committee or of a cabinet level committee, had served. And I do believe that these were unusual pressures, and they were events that place strain on institutions. That was my personal experience.
Right then, on the same page, I'd like to take you just above that paragraph that I read from, or the portion that I read from earlier on, where you are talking about your appointment, or rather your membership of the Safety and Security Portfolio Committee. You say, amongst others, you had to work on the Prevention of Organized Crime Act of 1999. And then you go on to say the act dealt with the seizure of the proceeds of unlawful activities. I would have loved to see these powers used without any fear or favor in the arms probe. Now, on what basis did you make the statement that you would have loved to see the seizure, the seizure provision being invoked with reference to the arms procurement?
Having a personal conviction, and that's all that it is, that it would have been impossible to have a strategic defense package of this magnitude without the possibilities of enrichment that may or may not have been legitimate or illegitimate.
Now, I'd like to then turn to page 42 of the book, unless there are questions.
Sorry, Mr. Ramachara. I'm not quite sure that I understand this clause that says the acquisition would have pushed our new democratic institutions to the brink of cardiac arrest. Can the witness maybe give an example of an institution that would have been thus adversely affected?
Yes, you may proceed to answer the Commissioner.
Rightly or wrongly, Parliament is an institution. And as a self-reflective witness who is no longer a political player, I think at least I have the indulgence of reflecting on my own role in that process.
In what way would Parliament have been pushed to the brink of cardiac arrest? In what way?
Bearing in mind that when one writes a book as opposed to giving testimony under oath, one is prone to hyperbolic expression because it's a completely different entity, a book, to a sworn statement before a commission, and I am engaging on the content despite that reservation. I think it would be important to indicate that SCOPA, as a parliamentary committee, went through a very challenging time. And I think that every member of SCOPA would have had a duty to the institution of the committee and to Parliament to reflect on the various roles we all played in that process. I've had the opportunity of taking distance from public life and having the opportunity to do so extensively. Not necessarily everyone had that luxury, but I believe that SCOPA was placed under an incredible amount of strain, and I think we all bear a responsibility for that.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Then I would like to take you to page 42 of the book. Page 42, the first paragraph, where you say, I raised key concerns about the manner in which the special investigating units, particularly the Heath unit, had been allowed to become, in my party's view, political footballs. Now, will you just explain as to what you mean in this particular sentence? It is page 42, there's third line, that's where you find the Heath unit had been allowed to become, in my party's view, the political footballs. Right, thank you.
Commissioners, I believe the grammatical error will announce itself and show you where the paragraph is, because I've just spotted a grammatical error. However, the issue for me was the extent to which a discourse emerged around the head of the unit and the personality of the head of the unit. That's to me where there were elements of political, how should I say this? For lack of a better word, political drama. I think there were different perceptions about the head of the unit. But for me, the issues were twofold at this time. The first was the Constitutional Court ruling around the head of the unit and separation of powers doctrine, which is a very important part of the conversation that occurred at that time. And the other was the issue of obscuring the discourses about the powers that the unit had as an entity in a broader discussion about personality politics. And that was my experience of this. And hence the expression.
Over to page 45. Now, in this page, you are dealing largely with the special review of the AG. And towards the middle of this page, you'll find a sentence that reads as follows. This hugely significant report would have profound consequences. It would shake the very foundations of the relationship between Parliament and the executive. Now, you were talking about this special review of the AG. And of interest is that, or rather what I would request you to explain to this commission is as to what you mean when you say it would shake the very foundations of the relationship between Parliament and executive, and where possible you can also refer to examples that you might have picked up as what illustrates this very shaking of the relationship between the two institutions.
Thank you. The one I alluded to this morning, when I alluded to the fact that SCOPA did receive a letter from the DOD indicating that the officials would not be able to answer all the questions that SCOPA had put to them in October of 2000 during a hearing on the special review of the Auditor General. And I think the fact that ministers were not involved in the hearing in October 2000 may have contributed to the way in which they viewed the 14th report. And I'm not advocating that anybody was right or anybody was wrong. I'm trying to point out where the tension points emerged that really placed a lot of pressure on the relationship between Parliament and the executive. That was one moment. I think an additional moment would have then been after this not happening. So in October, the officials go, having written saying they can't be there alone, minister should also come. And I was not a member of SCOPA at that time, so I should actually not be opining on this. I think others are going to be at much greater liberty to speak freely about what their interactions were at that time, what the reasons were not. I don't want to step into that space. I simply want to point out where the pressure points were. So the SCOPA chairperson did receive a letter from DOD indicating the officials can't discuss everything because some decisions were not taken at that level. Ministers do not appear because you can look at the transcript of the October hearing in 2000 and you will not see an appearance by ministers. The ministers then, in early January, after the 14th report of SCOPA is adopted in the National Assembly, which is the only role that I played in that as a parliamentarian because I'm a member of a collective at that stage that adopted the 14th report of the Standing Committee. The ministers then become quite aggressive towards the Standing Committee on Public Accounts very early in 2001. Again, this happened before I became a member of SCOPA. I was watching this like every other citizen of the country, watching the state president on national television having a press conference and then ministers having a press conference in short succession. So none of these issues I can claim personal knowledge other than the generic knowledge of a parliamentarian who was a parliamentarian. I was not a member of SCOPA. But as a parliamentarian, I thought that moment marked a significant tension point between the executive and the legislature, at least between the executive and the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, of which I was not a member at that stage.
In what way were the reputations of these investigating agencies harmed?
Yes, please proceed to answer. It's actually the next question I was going to ask, Commissioner. Yes, you may.
On the understanding once more that I am dealing with a book, not with my written statement, and I'm simply reflecting my opinion, and that is my understanding. If one looks at the special review, you would have noticed, and I'm trying to draw out the continuities. In the special review, the subcontracts were not probed, and the Auditor General raised a flag of concern about the subcontracts in the initial special review of 2000. In the JIT report, you can very clearly see the concerns of the Auditor General once more, because he actually points out in the JIT report that he had difficulty in accessing information from the Department of Defense and the Department of Trade and Industry. The Auditor General is also on record, the then Auditor General, pointing to those difficulties. And I do believe still today that the fact that the scope of the audit had to be limited in the Joint Investigating Team report but if we look at the fact that there's been a consistent limitation of scope on the subcontracting dimension, despite the fact that the Auditor General raised that concern as a concern in the special review and in SCOPA, and it became again a limitation in the JIT investigation, I do believe the limitation of scope potentially harmed the credibility of the investigation. It certainly did in my view.
Should I proceed, Commissioner?
So basically what you are telling us, it's your opinion. You don't have any other concrete evidence to support that position. Simply because, if I understood the evidence before us, we're told that the subcontractors, that was the function of the main contractors. The OD was involved only once or twice as far as the combat suite is concerned with the subcontract. But in general, only the preferred bidders were the ones who were interacting with the subcontractors. If that is the position, would I be correct to say that that is your opinion which you have told us as an outsider? Or do you want to say to us that you do have information which suggests that some of those subcontractors corrupted those who are supposed to make who are supposed to have made the actual decisions?
If I may, Commissioner, two issues, and I'd like to separate them. The first issue, I was not a member of SCOPA at that stage. So anything related to the strategic review in 2000, anything related to those issues is my opinion, editorialized. However, from the time that I became a member of SCOPA, and I took an interest in reading the Interministerial Cabinet Committee minutes, which I did in detail. And just please remind me again, evidence leaders, those are all declassified. Specifically with respect to the inclusion of the Corvette Combat Suite component and the risk element, as it is reflected in the Interministerial Cabinet Committee minutes, that to me suggested, at least in principle, with respect to that specific component, it would have necessitated a deeper look, and therefore the narrowing of the scope of the audit and the difficulties around DoD documentation and DTI documentation is a real issue. Again, I can't say that I have personal knowledge and that I can name and shame individuals. I don't have the forensic capabilities to do so. But the fact that the subcontract arose in the Interministerial Cabinet Committee in the way that it did, and I understand why it did, because it's a mission-critical component of the vessel. So there are big issues here. I understand why the scope limitations became a problem, and they were a problem to me then as a member of SCOPA when I became a member of SCOPA. And I think nobody is going to say that the history of procurement was not that primary contractors and subcontractors were separated in this way. I think the history of DoD procurement shows that, the history of the structures of DoD procurement. But in this particular case, the presence of the Combat Suite issue in the Interministerial Cabinet Committee minutes is an issue that warranted a closer look, and the scope limitation in the audit made that very challenging, if not impossible. But I have no personal knowledge.
So in other words, even about that issue that you're referring to about the Combat Suite, you have no personal knowledge about. What you're saying to us is that you suspect that something wrong might happen, go and investigate. Should I understand to be saying so?
Not entirely, because at this stage I was already a member of SCOPA. And if I may just turn to page 22 of the JIT report.
Are aware of what the JT report is saying. I want to hear from you as a witness. Captain saying to you that we have read the JT report. We want evidence. We have all read the JT report. We know what they are saying. What I'm trying to find out from you, you are referring to the combat suite. You seem to be suggesting that, the combat suite was discussed at the interministerial committee meeting. Do you know whether that was discussed or not? Do you have any evidence to back up that statement? Because I couldn't see it. Do you have any evidence to back up the statement that the combat suite was discussed at one of the inter-ministerial committee meetings?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is in the documents that are in possession of the Sariti Commission, to the best of my understanding from the evidence leaders. Am I to understand that that's not the case?
Chair, I think regarding this aspect, the interministerial committee minutes have been handed up during the presentation of evidence, and they are not many sets really. I think there are just about 5 sets that have been handed up, and I think just in the interest of time, it would assist to look at the minutes and then respond to this question. And that could also be addressed by the commissioners when they draw their report, because they would also refer to those minutes.
No, you are right, that we can do. Just that I was raising it to the witness because she refers to it. She refers to the discussions in the inter-ministerial committee meeting of the combat suite. I just thought that because seeing that she's talking about it, she might be having a quick reference to those minutes. That is why I was raising it with her.
Thank you, Chair. May I just maybe bring it to the attention of the commissioners that in our preparation for the hearing, the witness did ask for copies of the interministerial committee minutes, because the witness indicated that those minutes are among the documents that they had to see when they were under lock and key in the custody of Parliament. Now, she would not have an independent recollection of which minutes in particular would such reference be found. And what we did was just to inform her that the minutes at least are there and they are already on record. And also, due to time constraints, there was no opportunity, I think, to make copies of declassified minutes, because the declassification stamp has to appear on the minutes that would be handed over to her. So that was sort of a challenge, but I think it's only proper that we bring it to your attention as to what happened in relation thereto.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, just with the indulgence of the evidence leaders, just add that even though members of SCOPA had access to the documents, we were under strict instruction not to take notes, not to try and commit too much to memory, and to simply use this as the basis of our questions. So I unfortunately wouldn't have any personal documents in that regard. So I would have to rely on the declassification.
Ms. Lamakaka, Commissioner Muzi was also whispering to me. Can we just check whether the question of the combat suit, was it ever discussed at the inter-ministerial committee meeting? I can't recall that. And you and the witness seems to be saying that, there is that possibility. I can't recall seeing any of those minutes where the combat suit was discussed. Particularly the combat suit relating to the subcontractors.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Maybe I just need to correct the understanding of what I was addressing when I spoke about minutes. I did not say that definitely that there is an entry in the minutes where they are talking about, or where it's reflecting that the interministerial committee discussed the combat suits. All what I said is that the minutes are available, and in the event that we are unable to establish that now in this forum, the commissioners will have the opportunity to look at, I mean, if it's there in the minutes, it will be there. If it's not there, it's not there. And it will be properly taken care of ultimately in the report.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to hold up the process. I want to help us make progress, but I think there are just two issues that arise for me that are important. The one is a question of procedural fairness, because I assumed certain minutes were declassified. So in the interactions between myself and the evidence leaders, I think we just need to establish that as a procedural fairness issue for all sides. And also with respect to the minutes, I do not have infinite memory capacity, and it may be that I don't recollect the detail perfectly. I seem to have a recollection from the minutes, and I'm not stepping away from the statement, but I do want to have the comfort that I am relying on a memory that stretches back 13, 14 years ago with respect to details in minutes that I had for specific periods of time. So my own memory recollection may not be perfect, so firstly I want to place that before the Commission up front. And secondly, just as a matter of procedural fairness, if that has somehow in the declassification matter not been properly addressed between myself and the evidence leaders, I hope that no prejudice will be suffered by either party in that regard.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think the issue relating to the declassification and the existence of the minutes and so forth has been properly ventilated. It is on record as to what happened preceding the presentation of this evidence today. May I proceed? Thank you. Now, still on page 45 of the book, I want to take you to the last paragraph. The first, is the first sentence on the last paragraph. I'll read the relevant portion into the record as is. I know that you did mention that, I mean, when you wrote the book, you did not have the Commission in mind. That's understandable. But nevertheless, for all fairness, I'll read it into the record. And that reads, "The Pandora's box of gruesome delights that the Auditor General's first report opened would destroy lives, parliamentary careers, and institutions." I'll stop here and follow up with the following sentences. Now, what I'd like you to indicate to this Commission is as to whether you can point out the specific persons whose parliamentary careers were destroyed as a result of the special review report, as well as the institutions that were destroyed, as well as the lives that were destroyed by this report.
Once again, this is not the kind of document that one swears to under oath. These are emotive statements made in a book, which is reflecting on the experiences of an individual member of Parliament at a particular time. And in that regard, and this is not evidence, and I just want to clarify that, it's my opinion. I believe that former ANC MP Andrew Feinstein considers his life at least partly deeply affected by this. I personally consider my own life to have been deeply affected by this, and it certainly contributed to my decision to leave the National Assembly. It wasn't the only reason, but it certainly, you can see that in the rest of the book. And I think that there are a number of other individuals who may feel the same way. But I'm talking about feelings and opinions and editorializing. And I don't consider that to be evidence, so I'm really in the hands of the chairperson.
Any institutions that you'd also like to point out as being, in your opinion, institutions who might have been destroyed as a result of this report?
Under oath, I wouldn't use destroy because it would have a very specific meaning. But deeply impacted, I would use, and I do think that SCOPA and Parliament were deeply impacted by this. I also think that once again, we're in the editorializing space, I also believe that the way in which large-scale procurement is structured wasn't destroyed because it wasn't as if there was a template for that. But a template was created that I think we need to take some lessons away from and think about that very deeply. So impacted, yes.
Right, then I will proceed, unless there are questions from, I'll proceed to the next sentence. Yet it still represents the most truthful and honest first step assessment of the shortcomings of the acquisition process. Ironically, in my view, there would be major contradictions between this bare-knuckled probe by the Auditor General who had initiated the special review, a brave step for a new incumbent, and his subsequent report compiled as the convening head of the joint investigation team appointed subsequently. Now, what I'd like you to address is you're making reference to the fact that in your view, there appears to have been a marked difference between this report and the final report, or the report, yes.
Very challenging to reflect back on the memories of a politician 13 years ago, especially one who's no longer a politician, but I will try and keep it to a more legalistic expression. The language in the Joint Investigation Team report I considered to be toned down quite extensively from the language that was used with respect to deviations of process in the strategic review. That was my view at the time. And I have to say that it is also a matter of record that I engaged in an extensive amount of interaction with the then Auditor General about the provisions in the old Auditor General's Act and the way in which those provisions dealt with the manner in which audits occur of the intelligence structures in South Africa and indeed of the Special Defence Account. Because it was my view at that stage that with respect to the principles in the new constitution, the correct balance between transparency and secrecy, which does exist in these issues, intelligence and defence procurement, was not struck in the Audit Act as it existed then.
Page 46.
I understand. What are these major contradictions between the initial report by the Auditor General and the subsequent JET report? What are these?
The strength of the findings on deviations, the way in which it was expressed. I thought that the language in the Joint Investigating Team report was toned down considerably from the strength of the strategic review's finding. This is a matter of opinion. Two different people will read this and come to a different conclusion. But it had an undertone for me because I was concerned that the provisions in the Auditor General Act did not comply with the spirit of transparency that came from the new constitution. Specifically because the legislation in question, legislation that dealt with intelligence, legislation that dealt with defense, was legislation that came from another era, another country, if you look at the new constitutional standard. And as a consequence, I did not believe at that time that the Auditor General's Act struck the right balance. And I articulated that to the Auditor General in the way that a politician would, which I was at that stage, a politician, and I did so aggressively.
4 lives destroyed. Is there an example of a life that was destroyed?
With due respect to the commission, I do believe that there are people who would consider that their lives were destroyed by this. I can't speak for all of them. My life wasn't destroyed, but it was deeply impacted, and I can only speak for myself.
Do you know of any whose life was destroyed as a result of that report?
In my view, certainly former MP Andrew Feinstein's life has had a severe impact from these events. And that is my opinion, and different people will reach different conclusions on this.
Certainly not destroyed.
As I indicated, this is a book conveying my opinions. And this is not a statement under oath in that sense. And if there's an intention to create any statement under oath, I will not be doing that.
Is it what they call hyperbole?
Judge, it is a book. It is a book, it is editorialized opinion, and I'm not going to testify to specific names because I think different people are going to have different opinions, and I think we all need to also agree that perhaps in this forum so will we.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Then I'm reading from, page 46, the last sentence, and over to page 47. Scopa called on an all-party basis. It needs to be remembered for an investigation that would bring together the Auditor General, the Heath Special Investigating Unit, the Public Protector, the Investigating Directorate for Serious Economic Offences, and any other appropriate investigative body that could add value to the probe in terms of skills, formal powers, and legal mandates. Now here you are talking about that meeting where it was agreed in Pretoria that there was a proposal that an investigative body of this nature should be established. And then you say the report stated that SCOPA would issue an investigation brief to the team. I am well aware of the fact that at the time when that meeting was held, you were not as yet a member of SCOPA, but you subsequently became a member of SCOPA in January, February 2001. Now the question I'd like to ask is whether SCOPA did in fact issue that investigation brief to the team, or what is the position?
I split this into two. The one reflects certainly just as a backbencher sitting on my bench in Parliament, observing what was moving above and below the line as the House was adopting various reports. When the 14th report of SCOPA was adopted, it was adopted with no debate. And normally when that happens in the parliamentary environment, when a report simply moves from below the line, above the line, without any debate, it's an indication that there's not great contestation between political parties on an issue. So even though I wasn't a member of SCOPA, I had the perception that there was not great contestation or controversy in this report of SCOPA because it just mechanically moved from below the line to above the line and was voted through, and it was a report of the National Assembly. And it contained the paragraph that referred to the multi-agency probe, and that paragraph, and I don't recall the correct wording, and I don't have the 14th report in front of me, but we can check it. I think the wording was along those lines. It was crafted, I think, including wording around the lines of an investigation brief. I mean, we would have to check that for it to be on oath properly. But I can't remember the exact wording in the 14th report. But certainly in the meeting in Pretoria, and bearing in mind I was not a member of SCOPA, this was my first interaction where I sat with members of SCOPA who had worked together for years on an all-party basis. And I didn't get any indication of disagreement amongst the members of SCOPA at that time. And again, a big discourse developed and letters were written between the then chairman of SCOPA and the Speaker of the National Assembly on this issue. I have my perceptions, basically as a former parliamentarian, on those letters and the correspondence. And the binding nature of a parliamentary report of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, but I cannot claim first-hand knowledge specifically about what drove the interactions between the Speaker and the Chairman of the committee, or what drove the dynamic between the Chairman of the committee and the members of the committee. I simply don't have those memories.
The purpose of my question is just to establish as to whether the brief that went to the team, is it a brief that was issued by SCOPA, or was it issued by some other institution? And I'm asking you the question because I have already stated that at the time of the meeting, you were not as yet a member of SCOPA, but you subsequently, shortly thereafter, you subsequently became a member of SCOPA. And if you have issued a brief, then even if you come later into SCOPA, you would be part of the collective that is establishing as to whether the brief is being carried out in accordance with the terms set out in the brief. Hence my question, whether SCOPA did issue the investigation brief to the team or not, or you do not know.
The only direct knowledge of this that I can claim is that the 14th report as a report, which was adopted by the National Assembly, was the brief. If there was any other specific brief that was issued in the intervening period, or even flowing from that meeting specifically, I know that there was a conversation about the fact, and this even arose in the discussion amongst the agencies, that in the discussion where they were comparing their different powers that they would bring to an investigation to comply with the 14th report, they all discussed the fact that they couldn't assume that the Special Investigative Unit would be part of this because that requires presidential proclamation. That conversation I remember distinctively taking place within the confines of that meeting. Now, anything that happened between the timeline of that meeting and the time that I became a member of SCOPA, I can't speak to with any authority. But my perceptions about what the brief was, once I became a member of SCOPA, was that the brief was the 14th report. I can't go beyond that because that is really what I can claim personal knowledge of. I did subsequently see the letter that was written to the President regarding the proclamation or the possible proclamation for the Heath unit, but that only arose because once I became a member of SCOPA, all those documents became available to me in order to understand. But I had no knowledge in that timeline.
Okay, no, then that's fine. I think, like you say, you can't take it any further. It's only that what caught my eye is that in the book it says the report stated that the SCOPA would issue an investigation brief of the team, which then means that that report was not a brief. The report states that SCOPA would then issue the brief. But seeing that there is not much that you can assist with in that respect, I will then proceed to, unless there are questions from the commissioners, I will then proceed to the last sentence on that page, which reads, "The saga of the arms deal probe was merely beginning. In years to come, it would bring the country to moments of constitutional crisis and threaten the very heart of good governance in South Africa." Now, can you just explain to the Commission as to in what way would this acquisition bring the country to moments of constitutional crisis and threaten good governance in South Africa?
I think, with all due consideration and respect to the Commission, the fact that we're all here 13 years later partly attests to the fact. And I also believe that, and at that time, again, I'm being very careful because I will not step over 9(2) of the Electoral Commission Act. I will be very mindful of this. I'm reflecting the perspectives that I had as a then opposition politician. And in my view at that time, I looked at what was happening as I was sitting in my bench, looking at the other side of the House where my opposing political party sat. And to me, I perceived an enormous amount of internal tension in the party that was sitting opposite me in the House at that stage. And I thought that by virtue of the electoral outcome, given the size and importance of that party, that would have ramifications for institutions. But that reflects my views at that time. And I know that the chairperson may want to coax me further, but I'm going to resist very aggressively with Section 9(2) of the Electoral Commission Act, if I may. Because I can only reflect back on the views I held at the time in this regard.
You are dead right. I was just about to follow up on that statement that you have made, because I find it quite interesting.
Please be merciful with reference to Section 9(2), Chairperson.
You are correct. I'll keep that in mind. And for that reason, I'll prefer not to pursue this point. Thank you.
Right then. Shall we then proceed to page 48 of the book? Page 48, the last paragraph. Now, that makes reference to that cabinet statement of January, was it the 12th? And then which was followed by the appearance of the February 2001 before Scopa by specific ministers. And that reads, some weeks after the issuing of the cabinet statement, the Defense Minister Musiwa Teralekota, successor to Joe Modise, on whose watch the arms deal was concluded, also welcomed the probe, stating that any investigation that cleared the air could only be of benefit. This response stands in marked contrast to the subsequent way in which the executive would unleash the full fury of its powers and tactics on individual MPs, on Parliament, and Scopa itself in a series of acrimonious interactions that echoes to this day. Now, will you please just explain that paragraph, especially even when you refer to the acrimonious interactions between the cabinet ministers and the individual MPs, the Parliament, as well as Scopa?
Just firstly, just looking at the first part of that sentence, and I know you've been sitting through a number of very technical submissions, so I hope that some of the humor of a former political life may also be allowed in this chamber. At that time, former Minister of Defense Terry Lakota, during the interaction and the hearing with Scopa in February of 2001, very robustly indicated that he had requested the first investigation. And then subsequent to an interaction between himself and former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, he then wrote back to me clarifying the day after that meeting that was in fact not the case, that the Auditor General had approached the Department of Defense, but that's purely for your entertainment, because you've sat through a lot of technical discussions as well. But on the acrimonious side of things, I think the parliamentary environment became very charged around this issue. And that became clear just from the number of letters, press statements. And I didn't play a direct role in much of that because I was a committee member, and others would be able to speak to this with much greater authority because I was not the chairperson of my committee. I was a member of a committee. But at that stage, the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts received a plethora of letters from the Speaker, from the then Deputy President, from ministers. There were lots of letters, and all those letters ratcheted up the tension and contributed to fairly acrimonious exchanges, frankly, particularly between ruling party MPs and opposition party MPs, and that should not strike one as too strange in a parliamentary environment, but it was quite acrimonious.
Shall you then proceed to page 51 of the book? Second paragraph. Commencing with the sentence, I felt that it is the second line on the second paragraph. I felt that I had joined a gathering filled with loyal and committed heads of agencies and fellow MPs from Scopa motivated by a deep desire to ascertain whether these important procurement decisions had been informed by propriety. Now, out of reading this portion, did you, as a person, now I'm calling for your own opinion, did you have some reason to suspect that the procurement might have been the procurement decision might have been influenced by some propriety or impropriety?
One of the more, and I'm being very careful with how I choose these words, prior to my appointment to Scopa, even though I had absolutely no substantive interest in the defense industry, even intellectually, I did read quite a bit about the Al Yamamah 1 and 2 contracts in Saudi Arabia and the involvement of BAE Systems in that. And that at least gave me pause to wonder whether that would have been a possibility in the South African case. So I won't state it any stronger than that, but it certainly gave me pause to wonder if this is an operational mode that was applied in those two deals where commissions were paid, that's been admitted, and there are various issues on record in other jurisdictions in that regard. It did give me pause. Even though the evidence around commission payments and those issues only came out much later, but there were a lot of allegations as well in the British parliamentary environment about that, and that did give me pause.
Right, thank you. Shall we then proceed to page 52 of the book? I'd like to focus your attention on the second paragraph of the book. And I'd like to I'll read into the record the second, commencing from the second sentence on that paragraph, and it reads, I was particularly fascinated by the contractual aspects of the deal. Above all, I was interested in the possible nullification of the contracts on the ground of corruption, the enforceability of the national industrial participation agreements and their potential, if any, to offset what was a macroeconomically significant investment of money and the disputed overall cost of the procurement. Now, will you just explain to the Commission as to what is it that made you to be interested in the possible nullification of the contracts on the grounds stated in that paragraph?
Once again, I think it's important to reflect that members of Parliament also look very carefully at what the issues are that are of concern in the public arena and how they then reflect those issues back into their parliamentary activity. And there was a significant amount of speculation, discussion around corruption as a consequence of the tabling of the Dalil dossier. And I think it's important to reflect and pause, simply understanding that the real world of politics means that parliamentarians will take up issues that emerge in the public domain, issues that emerge that they put on one another's agendas, and they will follow those issues. So I would not be giving honest evidence if I didn't say that the broader impact of debates about corruption at that time ensured that a lot of members of Parliament were looking at these issues through those lenses. And I think it would have been the case for a number of MPs. And that's just a factual reality of how parliamentary politics works. What is difficult for me as well to reflect is to think back whether at the time of these experiences, as opposed to writing the book nearly 8-9 years later, I was as intensely focused on the corruption issues, or to what extent my, like with any other normal human being, memory reconstructs slightly when you look 8 years back. I think that happens too. But certainly with the kind of cut and thrust in the parliamentary environment, what was happening in the public arena at that stage was a lot of focus on corruption-related stories and allegations. Yes, there were allegations, but there were also documents that were leaked that are part of the media record around a variety of different allegations about some contracts, allegations about a variety of issues. So because we had access to the documents, I considered it my responsibility as a parliamentarian to understand what the implication would be if that were really to be true. Because I also served in the Finance Committee, and I understood that there would be consequences if that were to be true. And those consequences would be contractual, and they would be severe.
Thank you. Will you then proceed to page 72 of the book? I beg your pardon, page 62. I beg your pardon, Commissioners. Page 62.
I'm sorry, Mr. Ramakaka, just so that we can know how to reschedule our work. How long do you think you're still going to be busy with Mr. Ria? I'm not rushing you. I just want to plan. The other say it's already 4:15. I want to take a decision whether we should go on until we finish with or if we are going to be too long, whether we should adjourn until tomorrow.
Right. Thank you, Chair. It is our wish and intention to finish leading the evidence today. I'm unfortunately not able to state as to, or to give an estimation of how long I'm still going to take, but the indication I can give, especially in relation to the evidence that I have been placing on record with regard to the book specifically, I can indicate that I've gone beyond half the amount of evidence that I will be placing on record. And maybe I can say it can't be more than 25% of the time that I have spent that I'll still have to spend.
Ms. Plum, you're not helping us much. Hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours?
Chair, it will not be in excess of 1 hour.
Not in excess of 1 hour.
Yeah, it will not be in excess of 1 hour.
Is there any other person who might want to cross-examine? No cross-examination, Mr. Choi. Mr. Ramakaka, in that case, let's take a 5-10 minutes adjournment, and when we come back, we'll continue until you finish with the witness. Thank you. Let's adjourn for about 10-15 minutes.
re bone how to refigure this.
Can the witness confirm that she's still under oath?
I do.
Now, I'd like to take you to page 78 of the book. And where am I? I'm just going to ask a few questions. It's not going to take long, Chair. Page 78. Where's my 78? Yeah, we start with 78. I beg your pardon, Chair. Yeah, page 78, the bottom. Now, on page 78, I'll focus your attention to the last paragraph. Ne? Now, this is an area where you were talking about the press statements that were done by the executive and commenting on the speech that was made by the president. You say the following. The very next day, the Minister of Justice, no, let me start way back. However, his speech simply highlighted the controversial role the Speaker had played in aiding the Heath Unit's exclusion, an issue extensively touched on by Gavin in Scopa's meeting the day before. The speech also showed how the President had misused the legal advice obtained about the Heath SIU in his public broadcast, for the lawyers had actually recommended the fast-tracking of legislation to regularize the unit, a step that could secure its inclusion to the probe. Would you like to comment on that?
Just a simple comment. I am not a constitutional lawyer, neither am I a silk, but I did have the view at the time that the ruling of the Constitutional Court in terms of the head of the unit and the separation of powers doctrine could have been remedied by a fast-track amendment, and I believe that was the advice that was given as well, and I did simply note that that advice was not followed. And it became the reason for the exclusion of the Heath unit and the non-issuance of a proclamation.
Right, thank you. Now I would like to take you to towards the bottom of page, I'd like to take you to page 79 to 80. Ne? The last paragraph reads of page 79. As the presidency and Judge Heath became more entangled in a war of words, Mbeki flew to Davos for the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Mbeki arrived in Davos with the derailed arms probe like an albatross around his neck. It was in Davos too in 2007 that I would see Mbeki lose his composure when the British Serious Fraud Office announced that their probe into the British defense firm BAE Systems Saudi Arabian arms deal would be halted, while the probe of the BAE deals with South Africa and Tanzania would continue. His fury nearly derailed an entire session on investment in Africa. Any comment?
Well, again, the fact that it, in my view, derailed the arms probe, again, hyperbole, but in my view, it derailed certainly the issues related to the inclusion of the Special Investigating Unit. And I happen to have sat in on the 2007 session, and the focus was of the entire forum panel on investment, and it became a 15 to 20 minute discourse on the British Serious Fraud Office's double standard vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and Africa, and particularly South Africa and Tanzania.
Thank you, Chair. With regard to the book, that would be my last question. Unless there are any other points that, yeah, that will be my last question. And I'd like to take the witness back to her statement to deal with an area of, to deal with an item of conclusion. Now, will you please then go back to your statement at page 36? And will you just make your concluding remarks?
Thank you, and thank you, Commissioners. In the final conclusion, I simply tried to draw a couple of strands together because as I was working on this with the evidence leaders, I certainly thought a lot about the extent to which the legal framework moved and changed, and the extent of movement from the Exchequer Act and the transformation into the Ministry of Finance and the replacement of the Exchequer Act with the new PFMA, the new Ministry of Finance, just the enormous amount of institutional change that's occurred in the legislative space, and what that means for large-scale government procurement, and particularly for any future debates on a further defense package, if any. I mean, if there's going to be a discussion from the Defense Review about procurement in the future, it's going to look very different indeed from the period in the early 90s because the legal architecture looks completely different. And then the second issue also is related because at that time, Parliament did not flex its muscles in the budget space on these issues. Parliament now has set up a budget office, it has appropriation committees. It is an entirely different world from this time in that regard, even though it's at its fledgling stage in the budget office, but it would be a different scenario in terms of how the debate would take place, at least in principle terms. And then lastly, for me, I hope that if anything is taken from this entire period 13 years later, and indeed from the work of your commission, I hope it's going to be reflections as well about the discussions we're going to have as a country, because there is a new defense review. A new defense review will imply new defense procurement. And I hope that we're going to have the courage and conviction to all look very critically at what we bought and whether we're using it or whether we're not using it. I know that's part, certainly, of your brief. And I hope that those debates will take place, or they will certainly commence in this forum. And I wish you well for those, because I know that they will follow.
Right. Thank you. Just one follow-up. I have quoted from the book that you were, expressing a desire to have the contracts cancelled on the grounds stipulated in your book. But now, as you know, that one of the desired outcome from some quotas, it's about the cancellation of the agreements. What is your view presently about the cancellation of the agreements?
I would want to have an answer to that question once the Roland White memoranda have been declassified and they are in the public arena. But I think that it's very challenging to unscramble an egg, frankly. However much there may be a desire, and there certainly is a desire in certain quarters to look at this, and particularly to look at Section 217, and I know there have been various legal debates about that. I think it's incredibly challenging to undo a procurement of this nature. It is not impossible. I know that it has consequences. I also know that from a trading partner perspective, it has consequences. But the contracts have provisions for breach. The contracts have provision for a variety of issues that are not related to corruption. So it would be quite interesting to see whether this commission will look at the level of performance on industrial participation in a very critical way. Because breaches are triggered on a variety of different grounds in these contracts. But the issue for me is, are we using what we bought? Are they mothballed? Do we know? I haven't followed these debates in great detail because there's a new generation of parliamentarians who I'm sure have done so. And I'm sure you'll be interacting with some of them. But at a practical level, it's very challenging to go and undo these contracts. I know that there is a view that it will completely ruin South Africa's reputation as an investment destination. I know that those arguments have been made. But for me, there's also a pragmatic argument of what's happening in the defense budget and whether we can sustain what we bought and acquire what we need for the African Standby Force and for the regional brigades that are required in terms of the African Union commitments we've made.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. That concludes the evidence of Mr. Liard.
Mr. Liard, thanks a lot for coming to testify. I hope some of the evidence that we have led here will go a long way in helping us to carry out our mandate as we understand it. Two, I think I heard you talking about whether these weapons are being used or not. We have had evidence already in that regard. I think 5-6 people came and testified about utilization, which happens to be one of the terms of reference that we are supposed to deal with. But all in all, thanks a lot for coming to testify. I hope it was worth your trouble.
I'd also like to express my appreciation to the evidence leaders. This has not been a simple or easy process, and I think I threw them quite a curveball on 9-2, but they provided me with quite sound advice, and I want to express my gratitude. And also to the Commission, I wish you well, because you have extensive deliberations ahead.
Thank you. Advocate Mpaka, what is going to be the next step now? Because I think earlier on we did try and find out whether is there anybody who wants to cross-examine, and apparently there was nobody who wanted to cross-examine. So the witness is going to be excused because she has finished leading evidence. Thank you. Just before we excuse you, let me hear from Advocate Mpaka what the next step is going to be now.
Thank you, Chair. The next witness, I think, is David Menier, who will be testifying on Monday and Tuesday next week, the 11th and the 12th. Thank you, Chair.
11th and the 12th. And Advocate Mduma, can we make sure that his statement is posted on our website by the latest tomorrow?
We will do so, Chair.
Thank you. So we'll adjourn until Monday morning, and we'll start again Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Thank you. We'll adjourn.